From the autumn of one year to the spring of the next, I worked the overnight shift as a security guard at a shopping mall that had already died. The stores had all closed, the tenants had all moved out, and the whole place was sitting empty behind chained doors while the owners and the city argued over whether it would be torn down or sold. And until somebody settled it, the building needed a warm body to walk through it at night and make sure nobody stripped it for copper or burned it down for the insurance. That warm body was me. The pay was better than most guard work because nobody wanted it, and I found out fairly quickly why nobody wanted it. A dead mall at night is one of the loneliest places on this earth. During the day, with the sun coming down through the big skylights, it was only sad. A wide, bright, empty concourse with dry fountains and dead escalators and the ghost outlines on the walls where the store signs used to hang. But at night, with the power cut back to a handful of dim safety lights, it became something else. The concourse ran on into gloom in both directions, longer than it had any right to be, and every sound I made came back to me a second later off the far walls, my own footsteps following me at a distance like a second person always just out of sight. I had a golf cart to cover the length of it, and a flashlight, and a radio that reached a monitoring service in the city, and that was all. If I ever needed the police out there, I was told, the response time to that part of the county ran close to 20 minutes, and I had a lot of time on those long nights to think about how much can happen in 20 minutes. There was one man I ever really spoke to about the place, a maintenance worker named Denny, who came out during the daytime a couple of days a week to keep the boilers and the fire system running until the building's fate was decided. And I overlapped with him for an hour at the start of my shift when he was finishing his. Denny had been around that mall since back when it was still alive, and he did not like it one bit now that it was dead. He told me the first week I was there that most of the guards they hired for the overnight did not last past their first few nights, that the company went through them the way you go through matches, that a man would take the keys and the flashlight with a brave face and then hand them back a week later without much of an explanation, only that he could not do it, that being alone in that place after nightfall got into his head. I told Denny I needed the money, which was true, and I told him I did not scare easy, which I believed at the time, and he looked at me for a moment with an expression I did not understand then and understand very well now, and he said only that if I ever felt like I was not alone in there, I should trust that feeling and not talk myself out of it, because the building was too big to ever really be sure it was empty, and a man could walk those halls for hours and never cross the path of somebody who did not want to be crossed. He told me one more thing before he left that first evening, almost as an afterthought, pulling on his coat by the door. He said that a few years back, before the mall had fully closed, when there were still a couple of stores hanging on, a cleaning woman working late had gone into a back restroom in one of the empty wings and found signs that someone had been washing up in there, night after night, and that when they looked into it, they realized a person had been living somewhere in the building for who knew how long, using it, moving through it, and had never once been seen. They never found who it was, Denny said. The stores that were left closed not long after, and the guessing stopped mattering, but he had never forgotten it, the idea that a place that big could hold a person the way a coat holds a moth, folded away in some shadowed seam of it, present and unseen. Then he said goodnight, and he left me alone with the keys. And the truth is, I forgot all about that story within a week, filed it away as an old man's spooky talk, and it was only much later, standing over a nest of blankets in the black, that it came back to me whole. I laughed it off. I thought he was an old-timer, spooked by an empty building and the memory of what it used to be. I did not understand yet that he was giving me the single most useful piece of advice anyone ever gave me, and that I was about to ignore it. The first few weeks were quiet, or as quiet as that place ever got. I learned its noises, the tick of the metal roof cooling after nightfall, the sigh of air in the dead ventilation, the far-off drip of water somewhere in the shut-down plumbing, and I taught myself not to jump at them. I told myself that the movements I sometimes thought I saw at the edge of the flashlight beam, down a side corridor or behind the glass of an empty storefront, were nothing. Tricks of the eye, my own reflection, a bird that had gotten in through a broken vent. I told myself a lot of things on those walks to keep my mind level, and for a while I believed them. Then, in the middle of the winter, the small wrong things began. It started with a service door. There was a corridor at the back of the food court that led to the loading docks and the old stock rooms, sealed off behind a heavy door I kept locked. And one night on my rounds, I found that door standing open a hand's width, the way a door sits when it has been pushed shut but not latched. I told myself I had forgotten to check it the night before, and I locked it, and I moved on. 2 nights later, it was open again. Then there was the smell. In one wing of the mall, near the old department store at the north end, the air had begun to carry something it should not have, the low, sour smell of a place where a person is living without plumbing, food gone bad, and unwashed cloth and smoke, faint but unmistakable to anyone who has ever come across it, and it grew a little stronger every night I passed through, and there was the food. The vending machines had all been emptied when the mall closed, but there was a maintenance break room in the back with an old refrigerator I kept a few things in for my shift, a loaf of bread, some cans, and I began to notice that things were missing from it, a little at a time. A few slices of bread, a can of soup, not enough that I could be sure I had not simply eaten them myself and forgotten, but enough that the back of my neck started to prickle when I opened that refrigerator door. There were other signs, too, once I started letting myself notice them. The mall had lain empty long enough that a fine gray dust had settled over everything in the closed-off wings, the floors, the counters, the tops of the dead display cases, and dust does not lie. One night, walking a corridor near the old department store that I was almost certain no one had been down in weeks, my flashlight caught a line of marks in that dust along the floor, and I crouched over them, and they were footprints, a man's boot prints, coming and going, fresh enough that the edges were still crisp, tracking a path from the service door toward the sealed store and back again, a path that someone had walked many times. I found a metal chair from one of the old food court stalls dragged into a back alcove and set facing out toward the concourse, with a clear line of sight to the very route I walked every night on my rounds, and cigarette ends on the floor around it. And I understood, standing there, that someone had been sitting in that chair in the black and watching me make my circuits, learning my schedule, the same way you would learn the movements of an animal you meant to avoid, or catch. And once, only once, before the night of the cough, I came close. I was walking the upper level of the north wing a little after midnight, and as I came around a corner, my flashlight swept across the far end of the corridor, and for just a fraction of a second, at the very limit of the beam, I saw a figure step back out of the light and into a doorway, quick and silent, the unmistakable movement of a person who did not want to be seen. I froze. I called out, "Hello, security. Is someone there?" My voice cracking and far too loud in all that emptiness. And the echo of it rolled away down the concourse and came back to me, and nothing answered. And when I finally worked up the nerve to walk down to that doorway, there was no one in it, only a cold draft, and on the floor, a single wet boot print already drying at the edges. I told myself, even then, even with the print right there under my light, that I had imagined the figure, that it had been a shadow, a trick of the beam, because believing that was easier than believing the truth. And Denny's warning went around in my head. Trust that feeling. And I talked myself out of it anyway, and I finished my rounds, and I went back to the office, and I did not call anyone. And I have thought many times since about how close I came that night to walking right up to him in that doorway. I want to be honest and say that for a while I did nothing, because doing something meant admitting what I already knew, which was that I was not alone in that building, that somebody had found a way in and was living in the dead parts of the mall, while I walked my rounds through the lit parts, the two of us sharing the same enormous empty shell, and only one of us knowing it. I finally admitted it to myself on a night in late January, a cold, clear night with the wind pushing at the skylights, when I was doing my 1 a.m. walk through the north wing, and I heard, from somewhere behind the wall of the shuttered department store, a sound that no settling building makes. It was a cough. A low, wet human cough, quickly stifled. The sound of a person trying and failing to be quiet. And it came from the other side of the steel grate that sealed off the old store, from the black space beyond it where my flashlight could not reach. I stood absolutely still in the middle of that concourse with my heart going hard, and I did not call out, because some instinct told me that calling out would be the worst thing I could do, that I did not want the person behind that wall to know for certain that I had heard them. I backed away slowly, keeping my light on the grate, and I made my way to the security office at the center of the mall, and I locked the door, and I sat down and tried to think. I could have called it in right then. Looking back, I wish I had. But I told myself I did not have enough, that a cough behind a wall was not an intruder, that the monitoring service would want to know exactly what I had seen before they sent anyone the 20 long minutes out to that place, and that if I called the police out for a squatter and there was nobody there, it would be my job. So I decided, God forgive me for how foolish it was, that I would go and look, that I would find out for certain what I was dealing with before I made the call. I took my flashlight and a heavy ring of keys, and I went back to the north wing, and I found the maintenance door beside the sealed department store, the one that led into the back stock rooms, and it was open again, and this time I went through it. The stock rooms behind that store were a maze of concrete and steel, black as anything, the air thick with that sour Libden smell, and I moved through them slowly with my light, past empty shelving and stacks of broken fixtures, following the smell and a faint flicker of light I could see now, deep in the back, the small, unsteady glow of a candle or a camp lantern. And then my flashlight beam, sweeping ahead of me around a corner, fell on the place where the person had been living, and my stomach turned over. There was a nest of blankets and flattened cardboard on the floor, a camp stove, jugs of water, a heap of food wrappers and cans, and stacked against the wall, coiled and bundled, more copper wire and stripped fixtures and stolen goods than one person could carry, the work of someone who had been living in that building and quietly taking it apart from the inside for a long time, weeks, maybe the whole winter, the whole time I had been walking my rounds a few walls away and telling myself I was alone. And standing in the middle of that nest, caught in my flashlight beam, turning to face me, was a man. He was big and filthy and wild-looking, with a heavy iron pry bar in one hand. And for one long, frozen second, the two of us just stared at each other across that lantern-lit room, the intruder and the guard, each as startled as the other. And then he came at me. I did not think. I turned and I ran, back through the black maze of stock rooms, with my flashlight beam swinging wild across the walls, and behind me I could hear him coming, the heavy, fast slap of his boots on the concrete, and the scrape of that iron bar dragging along the shelving. And I ran for the maintenance door and through it and out into the dim concourse, and I did not stop. I have never run like that in my life. Out across the wide, empty floor of the dead mall, past the dry fountains and the black storefronts, my own echoing footsteps chasing me and his real footsteps chasing me. And I made for the one place I knew I could lock, the security office at the center of the concourse. And I hit the door and threw myself inside and slammed it and turned the bolt just as a heavy weight crashed against the other side of it. Once, twice, the iron bar ringing off the metal. I grabbed my radio, and this time I did not hesitate. I called the monitoring service and told them there was an intruder in the building, an armed man trying to break into the security office, and to send the police right now. And then I put my back against the far wall, and I raised the only thing I had, a heavy flashlight, and I watched that door shake in its frame, and I waited. The pounding did not last as long as I expected. After a minute or two, it stopped, and I heard the man's footsteps move off, fast, away down the concourse toward the far end of the mall. And then there was nothing but my own breathing, and the tick of the cold roof. The police took 23 minutes to arrive, and I counted every one of them from behind that locked door. And when they finally came through the front entrance with their flashlights cutting across the black concourse, I nearly wept with relief. They searched the whole building. They found the nest in the stockrooms, the blankets and the camp stove and the stolen copper, exactly where I had found it. But they did not find the man. Somewhere in the time it took them to arrive, he had gone back through the loading docks and forced a roll-up door and slipped out into the woods behind the mall, and he was gone. And as far as I know, they never caught him. The officers spent the better part of an hour going through the building with me, and what they pieced together was worse, in its quiet way, than the chase itself. The man had not just wandered in that night. He had been living in those back stock rooms for a long time, weeks at the least, maybe the better part of the winter, and he had made himself a home there. The nest of blankets, the camp stove, the jugs of water, a careful little life built in the black behind the walls of the store. He had worked out the whole rhythm of my shifts, when I started, when I did my rounds, which wings I walked and when, and he had timed his own movements around mine, coming out to strip the copper and the fixtures in the hours I was at the far end of the mall, retreating to his nest when I came near, and the service door I kept finding open was his door, propped so he could slip in and out without the sound of the latch giving him away. He had been stealing from that refrigerator because it was easier than carrying in his own food, close enough to my own break room, that some nights the officers guessed he had probably been in that room minutes after I left it. One of them found, near the nest, a spiral notebook, and in it, in a cramped hand, the man had been keeping notes, and some of those notes were about me, the times I passed certain points, the nights I seemed tired, the one night I had fallen asleep at the desk for an hour and not walked my 2 in the morning round at all. They did not let me read much of it, but they let me see enough to understand that I had been studied, catalogued, watched by a person a few walls away for the whole length of my employment there, and that he had known me far better than I had ever known, that I was not alone. I did not sleep well for a long time after that. For months I would wake in the small hours with my heart going, sure I had heard a cough or a footstep or the scrape of an iron bar, and I would lie there in my own bed in my own apartment and have to talk myself down, have to remind myself where I was. I quit the mall the next morning. I did not even work out the notice. I drove out there in the daylight, handed my keys and my flashlight and my radio to the first officer at the desk, and I walked out, and I never once set foot in that building again, and I heard, some months later, that they finally tore it down. I hope they did. Because the thing I carried out of that place, the thing I still carry, is not really the man or the pry bar at all. It is the understanding that came to me standing in that lantern-lit nest with my light shaking in my hand. And it is a simple thing, and it has never quite let me go. What stayed with me, long after I turned in my keys and quit that job and never went back, was not the chase, and it was not the pry bar ringing off the door. It was the understanding, standing in that lantern-lit nest with my flashlight shaking in my hand, that he had been there the whole time. That every long, lonely night I had spent telling myself I was the only living soul in that dead building, walking my rounds and eating from that refrigerator and talking myself out of the movements at the edge of my light. There had been another person a few walls away, awake in the black, listening to me pass, close enough to reach the entire winter long. I was never alone in there, not once. I only thought I was. A couple of winters ago, my wife and I put a small camera in our living room. One of those little security cameras you can watch from your phone, mostly so we could keep an eye on the dog while we were out. I never thought of it as anything more than that. I certainly never thought it would be the thing that saved us, or that one ordinary night I would sit in a parked car staring at that little glowing rectangle in my hand while my whole body went cold. Let me tell you a little about where we lived, because it matters to how the night went. We had a small house at the end of a long gravel road outside of town the last house before the road gave out into the trees, with our nearest neighbor a good quarter-mile off through the woods and no streetlights anywhere along the way. It was the kind of quiet my wife and I had wanted our whole lives, the kind where you can see every star and hear the wind in the pines and go a whole evening without a single car passing. And for the most part, we loved it. But a place that private has another side to it. And I had felt that other side once or twice in the months before the night I am telling you about. Small things I did not pay enough attention to at the time. A few weeks earlier, Claire had mentioned that she thought a truck had been parked out on the county road near the mouth of our gravel drive a couple of evenings in a row, just sitting there with its lights off and gone by morning, and we had decided it was probably a hunter or somebody pulled over to take a call. And once I had come home to find the gate at the top of the drive open when I was fairly sure I had latched it, and I had blamed the wind because blaming the wind was easier than the alternative. I know now that somebody had been watching our house, learning it, the way you learn a house before you go into it, when the cars came and went, which lights were on timers, how long the police took to reach that part of the county. And I know now that the small wrong things I had waved off were the shadow of that watching falling across our quiet life, and I did not see it, because you do not want to see it, because a place you love is the last place you want to imagine being watched. We lived at the end of a long gravel road outside of town, the last house before the road turned to trees, the nearest neighbor a good quarter-mile off through the woods, and for the most part I loved how quiet and private it was. On the night I am telling you about, my wife Claire was away at her sister's for the weekend, and I had gone into town after work to have dinner with a friend, and I was driving home late, close to 11, with the heater going and the radio low, tired and thinking about nothing in particular. It had been a good ordinary evening, the kind you do not think twice about until something turns it into the last ordinary evening of a certain part of your life. My friend and I had lingered over the meal longer than we meant to, the way you do, talking about nothing important. And I remember checking the time and being mildly annoyed at how late it had gotten, thinking about the long black drive back out to the house and the early start I had in the morning. I remember the ordinary weight of my own small concerns, the work I had the next day, whether I had left the porch light on, and I remember how completely those concerns were about to be swept away and replaced with one single thing. I texted Claire from the parking lot to say I was heading home, and she texted back that she would call in a few minutes to say goodnight, and I pulled out onto the road and pointed the car toward home. When I turned onto our gravel road, I did the thing I always did without thinking. I opened the camera app on my phone at a red light back in town, just out of habit, just to see the dog, and I had left the app running. The little live view of my unlit living room sitting there in the cup holder while I drove. It was Claire, on the phone, who noticed first. She had called to say goodnight, and I had her on the speaker in the car, and I mentioned in passing that the house looked pitch black on the camera, that the dog was not on his usual spot on the couch, and she said that was odd, because we always left the lamp by the window on a timer, and it should have been lit. I glanced down at the little rectangle in the cup holder, and she was right. The living room was completely black, and as I looked at it, slowing the car on the gravel, I saw something move across the frame. I want to be careful about how I say this, because in the moment my mind did everything it could to explain it away. A shape crossed the living room and the little screen, low, quick, and I thought, that is just the dog, of course. That is the dog moving in the black, and then the shape stood up. It rose up in the frame to the height of a grown person, and then a second shape moved behind it, and I understood, in a rush that emptied all the warmth out of me, that I was looking at two people standing in my black living room, two people who had no reason on this earth to be there, moving quietly through my house in the black while I watched them from a quarter-mile down the road. I stopped the car. I did not pull into the driveway. Some good instinct I did not know I had made me stop the car right there on the gravel, short of the house, with the headlights off, and I told Claire, keeping my voice as low and level as I could, that there were people in the house, that I could see them on the camera, two of them. and I heard her breath catch on the other end of the line. She told me to back up, to get away from the house, and I did. I reversed the car slowly down the gravel road in the black without headlights until I reached the neighbor's turnoff, and I pulled in behind their hedge where I could still just see the shape of our house through the trees, and I killed the engine. And I sat there with the phone in my hand and my heart slamming, and I watched. On the little screen, the two shapes moved through my house with a terrible calm. They were not hurried. They were not panicked. They moved from the living room out of the frame and then back into it, and the camera had a small microphone. And when I turned the volume all the way up, I could hear them, faint and tinny, the low murmur of two men talking to each other in my house, as though they had all the time in the world, the scrape of a drawer, the soft thud of things being set down and picked up. I could not make out the words, only the awful ordinariness of the tone, two people going about their business in my home in the black. I have tried, many times since, to describe what it does to a person to watch that, and I am not sure I can. It is one thing to imagine your house being robbed. It is another thing entirely to sit a quarter-mile away in the cold and actually watch two strangers move through the rooms where you sleep, past the couch where you read, through the kitchen where you make your coffee, handling your things, at home, in your home, while you can do nothing but hold a little glowing screen and breathe. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to do something, to drive up there, to lay on the horn, to shout, to protect what was mine. And every one of those instincts was wrong, and the hardest work of that whole night was holding still against them. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the phone steady. At one point I fumbled it, and it dropped into the footwell, and the screen went face down, and I lost the picture for a few seconds. And in those few seconds, sitting in that black car, unable to see them, my mind conjured every possible thing. That they had heard me, that they were coming down the road, that a face would appear at my window. And I have never groped for anything as desperately as I groped for that phone in the black of that footwell. When I got it back and the picture came up again, and the two shapes were still there in my living room, still calm, still unaware, the relief of it nearly made me sick. I need to go back a moment and tell you about the seconds when I first understood what I was looking at, because they were the worst seconds of the whole night, worse even than the crawl space, and I have played them over more times than I can count. When I first saw the low shape cross the frame, my mind did what a tired mind does at 11 at night. It reached for the ordinary answer, and the ordinary answer was the dog. Of course it was the dog. We had a big dog, and he moved through the house in the black all the time, and for a moment the low, quick shape was simply him, and my heart did not even quicken, and then it rose. I watched the shape stand up, unfold upward in the frame to the height of a grown man, and my mind tried to hold onto the dog for one more second, tried to tell me the camera angle was strange, and then the second shape moved in behind the first, taller than the couch, moving with the deliberate quiet of a person who does not want to be heard, and the last of the ordinary answers fell away, and the truth came into me all at once, cold and complete, that those were two men, that they were in my house, that they were standing in my living room in the black, while I sat watching from a quarter mile down my own road. There is a particular feeling that comes with that kind of understanding, and I had never felt it before that night, and I have never forgotten it since, a sort of falling sensation with no floor at the bottom of it, the ground of your ordinary safe life simply opening under you. And I sat in that car on the gravel, with the engine still running, and I could not, for a moment, make my hands or my voice work at all. Claire, still on the phone from her sister's an hour away, told me she was calling the police on her sister's phone right then, and to stay where I was, to not go near the house, no matter what. And I promised her I would not, and I meant it. And then I sat in that cold car behind the neighbor's hedge and did the hardest thing I have ever done, which was nothing. I watched two strangers move through everything I owned, and I did nothing but wait. At one point, one of the shapes crossed to the living room window, the one that looked out on the driveway, and stood there for a moment, looking out into the black. And I slid down in my seat, even though there was no possible way he could have seen me. and I heard his voice come thin and flat through the little speaker, and though I could not be sure, it sounded to me like he said, "The car is not here," and then he turned away from the window and moved back into the house. The police took close to 15 minutes to reach that part of the county, and I counted every minute of it behind that hedge, watching the little screen, and it was the longest 15 minutes of my life. I want to try to give you those 15 minutes, because sitting through them changed me. The car was cold, and getting colder, and I did not dare start the engine again for fear the sound would carry up the gravel to the house. So I sat there in the cold and the black with my breath fogging the windshield and my eyes fixed on the little screen. The two shapes came and went in the frame. At one point, both of them left the living room entirely, and the picture showed only my empty room for the better part of a minute, and I did not know where in my house they had gone, and that was almost worse than watching them, the not knowing, the imagining of them in the bedroom, in the closets, in the places the camera could not see. Twice I heard, through the thin, tinny microphone, a sound that turned my stomach, the ordinary domestic sounds of my own house being used by strangers, a cabinet closing, water running for a moment in the kitchen tap, and each ordinary sound was its own small horror because of who was making it. I kept the phone in one hand and my own phone lit in the other, with the emergency line already dialed and my thumb over the call button in case they came out the front. In case a pair of headlights that were not the police came down that gravel road toward me, and I ran through, over and over, what I would do, where I would drive, and none of my plans were any good because all of them ended with me abandoning my house and everything in it to two men, and I hated every one of them, and I sat still anyway. The worst moment of the wait came near the end of it, when one of the shapes crossed back into the frame and stopped and seemed to look, for a long moment, directly up at the camera, its face a pale smudge tilted toward the lens, and I was certain, in that moment, that they had found it, that they knew they were being watched, that they would come looking for whoever was watching. And I slid down in the seat with my heart going like a hammer, and then the shape turned away and moved off, and I do not know to this day whether they ever knew the camera was there. When the patrol cars finally came up the gravel road, I saw their headlights swing across the trees, and I saw the two shapes on the camera stop and freeze, and then move quickly out of the frame toward the back of the house, and then the camera showed only my empty, shadowed living room again, and the officers went in through the front door with their flashlights, and I watched their beams sweep across the frame, and I finally let myself breathe. They searched the whole house. They found the back door forced open and a window in the mudroom broken from the outside, and they found the dog shut in the bathroom, frightened but unhurt, which is a small mercy I am still grateful for. But they did not find the two men. Room by room, closet by closet, they cleared the house and found no one, and they came out onto the porch, and one of them walked down the driveway to where I had finally pulled the car up, and he told me it looked like a burglary interrupted, that whoever had been inside had likely gone out the back the moment they saw the headlights, that these things happened more than people thought out in the county, where response times were long and houses sat far apart. He was calm and kind and completely wrong, and he had no way of knowing it, and neither did I, not yet. I almost thanked him and went inside. That is the part that stays with me, how close I came to simply walking into my own house and closing the door and going to bed with the thing that was actually still there. But Claire was still on the phone with me, pressed to my ear the whole time, and as I started up the porch steps, she said, in a strange, careful voice, "Wait." She said she had heard something on the camera in the last minute before the police went in that she had not told me about because she had not wanted to frighten me while I was alone in that car. She said that just before the headlights came up the road, she had heard one of the men say, low and clear, "They will not check the crawl space." I stopped on the porch steps. I told the officer what my wife had just told me, and I watched his face change, and he called the other one back, and the two of them went inside again, and this time they did not sweep the rooms. They went straight to the mudroom, and they pulled up the rug in the closet, and there was the hatch to the crawl space set into the floor, and one of them stood back with his hand on his holster, and the other one reached down and pulled it open. The two men had been down there the entire time. They had been folded into the black under the house, a few feet beneath the officers' boots, while the search went on above them, holding still, waiting for the police to decide the house was empty and leave, so that they could climb back out and finish what they had come to do, or slip away into the woods, whichever they had planned. If Claire had not heard that one flat sentence come through the little microphone, if the camera had been a foot to the left, or the men had spoken a little more quietly, the police would have driven away, and I would have gone to bed in that house with two strangers waiting under the floor. It did not go that way. The officers got them out, and it was over. And I stood in my own yard in the cold, with my legs not quite working, and the dog pressed against my knees, and my wife's voice still in my ear, and I understood how narrow it had been. I never learned who they were, or how long they had been watching our house, to know our habits, to know that the lamp was on a timer and the car meant someone was home. But I have thought many times about that quarter-mile of gravel road, and about the small good instinct that made me stop the car short of my own driveway, and about the fact that if I had not glanced at that little glowing rectangle out of idle habit at a red light in town, I would have driven up to my own unlit house that night and walked in through my own front door, alone, with two strangers standing quietly inside in the black, waiting. We did not stay in that house much longer. Claire came home the next day, and we tried for a few weeks to go on as we had before, and we could not. The quiet we had loved so much had turned into something else, a quiet with a question in it. And every evening when the light failed, I found myself watching the tree line at the end of the drive, and every time the dog lifted his head at a sound outside, my heart would climb into my throat. We put better locks on the doors and bars on the mudroom window and 2 more cameras on the outside of the house. And none of it helped, because the thing that had been taken from us was not really our sense of safety in that particular house. It was our belief that being far from other people meant being far from harm, and that belief does not come back once it is gone. We sold the place before the next winter and moved closer to town, onto a street with neighbors close on either side, and street lights and the ordinary noise of other lives nearby. And I have never once missed the stars. I still have the camera. It sits in the new living room, watching the dog, and most days I forget it is there. But every so often, late at night, I will open the app just to look, just to see the ordinary empty room, and I will remember the 2 shapes rising up out of the black in that other house, and the flat, calm voice saying they will not check the crawl space, and I will feel again how close the whole of my life came to going a different way, and I will put the phone down and go and check that the doors are locked, and I will be grateful, in a way I never was before, for the sound of a neighbor's television through the wall. I want to tell you about the most frightened I have ever been over absolutely nothing, because even now, years later, the memory of that night can still make my heart pick up, and the ending of it still makes me laugh. In my early 20s, I shared a 3-bedroom apartment on the 5th floor of a big complex with 2 other women. I will call them Megan and Dana. Megan and I shared the largest bedroom, and Dana had the smaller one to herself, and the 3 of us got along well enough and mostly stayed out of one another's business. We had only lived together for a few months at that point, all of us new to the city and new to the neighborhood, drawn together by an online listing rather than any long friendship. And I mention that because it matters to how frightened we let ourselves get. 3 near strangers in an unfamiliar place, with no family close by, and only a vague sense of which sounds a building was supposed to make, and which it was not. The complex itself was one of those enormous places, a dozen floors, hundreds of units, the kind of building where you can live for a year and never learn the name of the person across the hall, and normally it hummed with life, doors and elevators and footsteps and muffled televisions at all hours, a constant background of other people that you stop noticing until it is gone. This all happened over a long holiday weekend when the whole complex had emptied out. Almost everyone on our floor had gone home to their families for the holiday, and the building had that hollow, echoing, half-abandoned feeling a place gets when nearly everyone leaves at once. The hallways too quiet, the elevator arriving too fast, your own footsteps suddenly loud on the tile. I had noticed it earlier in the week, the draining away, the parking lot emptying car by car, the windows going black floor by floor, and it had given me a faint uneasiness I could not name, the feeling of a big machine winding down, of being one of the last few people left inside something built for crowds. Dana had told us she was going back to her hometown for the weekend and would not be home until the following day. So as far as I knew, it was going to be just Megan and me in the apartment. And then, that particular night, just me, because Megan was out until late. I had picked up an extra shift at work and did not clock out until well after midnight, and by the time I got home to the complex, it was close to 2 in the morning. I was exhausted, running on nothing, wanting only to fall into bed. I rode the elevator up to the 5th floor, and the hallway was dead silent, and because our building had one of those keypad locks on the apartment door, I did not need to knock. I just punched in the code and heard the familiar little beep and the click of the bolt and pushed the door open. And the moment I stepped inside, I froze, because the apartment was completely black. Not dim, black. We always left a small lamp on in the living room for whoever came home last, and it was never off. And yet there was not a single light on anywhere, and the blackness felt so total and so heavy that the air itself seemed thick with it. I stood just inside the door with my hand still on it, and I remember the particular quality of that stillness, how it was not the ordinary stillness of a sleeping home, but something with a held quality to it, the way a room feels when it is not as empty as it looks. I told myself the obvious things. Megan must have gone to bed and turned everything off. The lamp bulb must have burned out. I was tired and jumpy from the late shift in the empty building. All of it was reasonable, and none of it quite touched the feeling in my chest, which was the plain animal certainty, underneath all the reasonable thoughts, that something in that apartment was wrong. I took out my phone and turned on the flashlight, and the little beam cut across an empty living room that looked exactly as it always did, and somehow wrong. The shapes of the couch and the television and the kitchen counter, all in their places, and all made strange by the way the beam picked them out one at a time and left everything around them in black. And I made myself walk toward the bedroom I shared with Megan, and I called out softly, "Megan, are you home?" And no one answered. I reached our door, and it was shut, and I knocked and said, "Megan, open up. It is me." And I had to say her name 3 or 4 times before I finally heard the lock turn and the door opened a crack, and a hand shot out and grabbed my arm and pulled me inside. And Megan shut the door behind me and locked it fast. She was white as a sheet and shaking. I asked her what was going on, why all the lights were off, and she put a finger to her lips and then leaned in close and whispered, in a voice that was barely there, that she did not know why the power was out, but that was not the problem, that there was someone in the other room. My stomach dropped. I whispered back that was impossible, that Dana was away, and Megan's eyes filled, and she said she knew. She knew Dana was supposed to be gone, but that about an hour ago she had heard the front door open and close, and then footsteps, heavy footsteps, moving around the living room, and then someone had come to our bedroom door and knocked, twice, softly, and she had been too afraid to answer because she had thought she was alone in the apartment. She said there had been news lately of break-ins on the other side of the complex, and that 2 young women alone in a half-empty building on the 5th floor felt like an easy target. And so she had turned off her light and locked the door and sat in the black, hoping whoever it was would leave. I asked her if she was sure, and she gripped my arm and whispered, "Listen." And the 2 of us went completely still, and after a moment I heard it too, a soft creak of the floorboards out in the hallway, the sound a floor makes under a slow, careful weight. I did not know what to do. If it was a burglar, were they waiting for us to come out? But we could not sit in the black forever, And I told Megan that the first thing we needed was light, that if we could get the power back on, we would at least have some advantage, that fighting in the black was the worst thing we could do. So we gathered our nerve. I held my phone up like a weapon, and slowly, quietly, we opened the bedroom door and stepped out into the black hallway, where every shadow looked like a person standing against the wall, and we crept toward the electrical panel by the front door. I have to tell you that those few steps down our own short hallway were among the longest I have ever taken. We went one slow foot at a time, staying close together, my flashlight beam trembling ahead of us, and every doorway we passed was a black mouth that my mind filled with a waiting figure, and every time the beam swung across a coat on a hook or the tall shape of a bookshelf, my heart stopped for the half second it took to understand what I was looking at. Megan had a fistful of the back of my shirt, and I could feel her shaking through it, and I was shaking too, and we did not say a single word. We just moved, and the whole apartment seemed to have grown larger in the black, the hallway longer, the distance to the front door greater than it had ever been in the daylight. I raised the flashlight to the row of breakers, and every one of the switches in the panel had been flipped to the off position. Megan grabbed the back of my shirt and breathed. Someone shut them off, and I said, trying to sound reasonable even though I did not feel it, or maybe one just tripped and pulled the others. But even as I said it, I did not believe it, because breakers do not flip themselves all the way down in a neat row, and the sight of that whole panel switched deliberately off did more to frighten me than any sound had, because it meant a hand had been here, at this panel, by our own front door, doing this on purpose. And the question of why a person would want the apartment plunged into black was a question I did not want to follow to its end. And I reached up and pushed the main breaker back into place, and the lights hummed and flickered and came on all at once, and the sudden brightness left us blinking. The living room was empty. Nothing had been taken. The television and our laptops were all sitting exactly where they belonged. I said quietly, "Check Dana's room," and we walked down the short hall to the second bedroom, and the door was closed, and I reached out and tried the handle, and it was locked from the inside. Megan backed away and whispered, "You see, Dana is gone, and she has her key. Someone got into the apartment and locked themselves in her room." That was the most terrifying moment of the whole night. The certainty that a stranger was standing a few feet away on the other side of a thin wooden door, and that they were being completely silent, and that they knew we were out here. I put my hand flat against that door for just a second. I do not know why, and it was cool and solid under my palm, and I remember thinking that a few inches of cheap wood was the only thing between us and whoever was standing on the other side of it, and that the handle would not lock from the outside, which meant that whoever was in there had turned that little button on the inside knob themselves, had deliberately shut themselves in, and had then gone completely quiet. There is a particular horror in a silence that is being kept on purpose. An empty room has an easy silence to it, a silence with nothing behind it. This was the other kind, a held silence, a silence with a listening in it. And standing in that black hallway with my palm on the door, I was as certain as I have ever been of anything that on the other side of the wood there was a person standing just as still as we were, holding just as quiet, listening to us listen to them. Megan made a small sound in her throat, and I took my hand off the door, as though it had gone hot, and we ran back to our room and locked ourselves in again, and sat on the bed, too frightened to move, whispering about whether to call the police. But what if it was nothing, we said to each other. What if it was a locked door and a tripped breaker and a knock that meant nothing, and we could not make ourselves make the call? And so we decided to wait for morning, and neither of us slept. We just sat there staring at the door and flinching at every small sound in that too quiet building. And there were sounds. That is the thing I remember most clearly about those hours. How the silence of that emptied-out building was not really silence at all once you were straining to listen to it. how it was full of small creaks and ticks and settlings that meant nothing on an ordinary night and meant everything now. A pipe knocked somewhere in the walls, and we both jumped. The refrigerator in the kitchen cycled on with a hum, and we gripped each other's arms. Once, and I will swear to this even now, we heard the floorboards in the hall outside our room give a slow creak, and then another, the exact sound of a careful weight shifting, and we sat frozen with our eyes fixed on the strip of light under the door, waiting for a shadow to break it, and none came, and after a while we breathed again. We went back and forth about the police a dozen times in hushed voices. Megan wanted to call, then she did not, because she imagined the embarrassment if it turned out to be nothing. Two young women who had called the police over a stuck door. Then I wanted to call, and then I imagined the same thing, and also imagined the opposite, that if there really was someone in that room, the sound of us on the phone might be the thing that made them come through the door before help could arrive, and so we talked ourselves out of it again. And this is a thing I have thought about a great deal since. How fear and embarrassment can tangle together so tightly in a person that they will sit for hours in danger rather than risk looking foolish. How the worry about being wrong can be nearly as strong as the worry about being right. We were not being brave. We were being paralyzed and calling it caution. So we waited, and the night crawled by, and the strip of light under the door stayed unbroken. And every so often one of us would whisper, "Did you hear that?" And the other would whisper, "I do not know." And we would fall silent and listen again to a building that would not quite let us decide whether it was empty or not. Finally, around 5 in the morning, the sky outside the window began to go gray, and the daylight gave us just enough courage to decide that we could not live like this and that we had to face whoever was in that room. We made a plan. We went to the front door and left it standing wide open so we would have a clear way out if we were attacked, and then we armed ourselves, and I am a little embarrassed to tell you how. I went into the kitchen and took a bag of chili powder from the shelf and the handle of a broom, and Megan took a small kitchen knife, and it all felt ridiculous and desperate at the same time. I whispered, "Ready," and Megan nodded, trembling, and we crept to Dana's door, and my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. In the name of God, I banged on the door with the broom handle and shouted, trying to sound fierce, "Who is in there? Open this door." And we heard movement at once, the creak of bed springs, the sound of someone waking, and then slow, heavy footsteps crossing to the door. And Megan raised the knife, and I twisted open the corner of the bag of chili powder, ready to throw it in the intruder's eyes. The lock clicked, the handle turned, and the door swung open. And there stood Dana, hair a mess, eyes half shut with sleep, blinking at us in confusion. She looked at the broom, and the knife, and the bag of chili powder held up in my hand, and she gave us the flattest, most annoyed look I have ever received from another human being, and she groaned, "What on earth do you two want at this hour? Have you both lost your minds?" We stood there frozen. The knife came down slowly, and the broom handle dropped to my side, and I felt my whole body go weak with a feeling I did not have a name for. I stammered, "Dana, you are home." She yawned and said, "Of course I am. I came back a day early, and my phone died on the drive, so I could not text either of you. And I got in around 1 in the morning, and I was so tired I just went straight to bed." I asked her about the lights, and she said, "Oh, that. The iron was acting strange when I plugged it in to press a shirt for tomorrow. It sparked and everything went out, and I did not know how to fix the breaker, so I just went to sleep and figured I would ask you both in the morning." And Megan asked, in a very small voice, about the knock. And Dana said she had knocked on our door when she got in to tell us the power was out, but no one had answered, so she had figured we were asleep. We stared at her. Not once, in that entire long night of sitting in the black armed with chili powder and terrified of a burglar, had it crossed either of our minds that the person in that room might simply be Dana. I finally managed to say, "Nothing, Dana. Go back to sleep," and she rolled her eyes and shut the door, and Megan and I walked back to our room and closed the door and looked at each other, and the fear broke all at once and turned into laughter, the helpless, aching kind that leaves you sore. We had spent 5 hours terrified of a monster or a burglar, armed with a broom and a bag of chili powder, ready to fight for our lives. And the whole time it had only ever been our own roommate, who had come home early and wanted nothing in the world but to sleep. When I think back on it now, what gets me is not how frightened we were, but how completely reasonable every step of our fear had been from the inside. Every single sign had pointed the way we read it. The lights really had been off. The breakers really had been thrown. There really had been footsteps, and a knock, and a locked door with someone breathing behind it, and a person who stayed silent when we called out. We had not imagined any of it. We had simply never once, in all those hours, allowed ourselves to reach for the one ordinary explanation that happened to be the true one, because the empty building and the dead phone and the holiday quiet had primed us to expect a horror. And once your mind is set to expect a horror, it will fit every fact it finds into that shape and lock the door on any other. Dana had walked in tired at 1 in the morning, found the power out, knocked to tell us, gotten no answer, and gone to sleep. The most ordinary sequence of events in the world, and we had built it, brick by frightened brick, into a home invasion. It was genuinely frightening while it was happening. I do not want to make it sound as though we were foolish, because in the moment, with the breakers thrown and the door locked and the silence behind it, I think most people would have felt exactly what we felt. But we laughed about it until our stomachs hurt over breakfast the next morning. The three of us at the kitchen table with the sun coming in and the chili powder still sitting out on the counter where I had dropped it. Dana shaking her head at us, and we have laughed about it every time it has come up since, for years. The night we nearly maced our own roommate for the crime of coming home early and going to bed. And underneath the laughing there is a small, real lesson that I have carried out of it, which is that the mind left alone in the black with its own fear is the most convincing storyteller you will ever meet, and that it is worth remembering when every sign seems to point one terrible way, that the ordinary answer is usually still sitting there in the room with you, waiting to be let in.